it's wonderful to be here. I'm really looking forward. I admire it's the work that so many of you are doing, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you're doing. As Honar said, I want to talk a little bit about global infrastructure. We all know that microwaves are bouncing between millions of cell phones, and computers are synchronizing, and shipping containers are locking and stacking, and calibrating global transportation and the production of goods, and credit cards, all 0.76 millimeters thin, are all sliding through slots everywhere in the world. All of this ubiquitous, seemingly innocuous features of our world that we call global infrastructure. And yet still the word infrastructure typically conjures associations with physical networks for transportation or communication or utilities, often considered to be some kind of hidden substrate. And this audience needs no convincing that infrastructure is more than a grid of pipes and wires, more than pools of microwaves beaming from satellites, and populations of atomized electronic devices that we're holding in our hands, more than shared standards for controlling everything from technical platforms to management styles, more than an Internet of Things, a world bristling with sensors and technologies that are gigantic and microscopic in the stratosphere, clasped in the hand, circulating in the gut. But going further, what I concentrate on, and why I'm asking us to kind of speed through the images of the space in which we're swimming, the retinal afterglow is of a soupy matrix of details and formulas that make most of the space in the world. So buildings, that we, for an architect, we usually think of as singularly crafted enclosures or geometrical formal objects, are now reproducible products. They're spatial products. They're a recipe, a formula that proliferates globally. This is the familiar confetti of boxes that are nestled in black asphalt or bright green grass, and telling the stories about Arnold Palmer or beard papas or cream puffs, or it's the same in Milwaukee, or this is Inner Mongolia. And now not only buildings, but also entire cities have become mobile, monetized technologies. Not in their physical thing, but in their recipe, their infrastructural technologies, in their recipe for assemblage. So we no longer build cities by accumulating masterpiece buildings. Architecture, my discipline, makes the occasional stone in the water while the world is blasting out the water. Again, not an infrastructure of pipes and wires hidden in the ground, but a cartoon of abstract technical and economic logics that's really pressing into view. And the typical urban formulas replicate something like Shenzhen or Dubai, anywhere in the world, with a drumbeat of generic skyscrapers. So the infrastructural technologies are then, again, not only the urban substructure, but the urban structure itself, the formula. For the space itself is a technology and a carrier of information. We're perhaps less accustomed to the idea of space as a technology or a medium of information like mobile telephony or like computing, where the information isn't object or text. It's not carried on wires or microwaves. It's in invisible, powerful activity that determines how objects and content will be organized and circulated. The technologies of infrastructure space, what I'm calling infrastructure space, have the power and currency of not text, but software, a kind of operating system for shaping the city. And like an operating system, infrastructure space makes certain things possible and certain things impossible. It's not the declared content. It's not the building that you see in profile and outline. It's the content manager. It's the thing that's dictating the rules of the game. It's the updating platform that's unfolding in time and handling new circumstances, encoding relationships between buildings, dictating logistics. So even though for architects especially it's hard for us to think about buildings as doing something, having agency, but infrastructure space is doing something. The forms are not object forms like buildings, but active forms like bits of code in the software that organize building. And information resides in these undeclared, sometimes undisclosed activities of the software. The protocols, the routines, the schedules, the choices it manifests in space. Many of you, because I admire and know your work, many of you are trying to capture a cultural imagination with a kind of mediagenic scenarios, projections and fictions about new technologies, their opportunities, their cautions, and to do that, you have to, whatever it's design fiction or tell some story, some kind of often fantastic, astonishing, dramatic, beguiling, wry story. With what I do, in some ways, I'm not able to show you things, but rather softwares of relationships, routines between things in space that have become a technology. But I can easily report that this infrastructure space, is the secret weapon of some of the most powerful people in the world, precisely because it orchestrates activities that can remain undeclared, but nevertheless consequential. And some of the most radical changes in the globalizing world aren't being written in the language of international law or diplomacy. They're being written in this infrastructure space. That's these spatial technologies. And that's creating a kind of de facto form of polity faster than even quasi-official forms of governance can legislate it. So the world's spatial products are orchestrating undeclared activities that are capable of outpacing law. And I'll show you some examples in which that's the case. So these massive global infrastructure systems administered by mixtures of public and private players, often driven by profound irrationalities, form a kind of extra statecraft. That's the name of this book that I'm working on. And it's wilder, I think, a sort of wilder mongrel than any of our familiar leviathans. Where extra statecraft, a portmanteau that means both outside of and in addition to the state. So we need evidence of this infrastructure space, of this infrastructural operating system, but we also need to know how to hack into it. And right now, the operating system is coded by quants and 28-year-old McKinsey consultants and yes men from the World Bank, and it's discussed in technical terms of informatics and econometrics. And space, however durable, is a kind of ecstatically elaborate byproduct. No one's leading with spatial variables. No one's writing a kind of spatial software. It would be pretty easy for us as architects to focus on object forms, new technologies, sci-fi, dystopic scripts, political arias. That's usually what we do when, that's kind of our default, ridiculous default mode when asked to do something political. It's kind of scripted in this queasy way. And we're already good at that. But what the world could really use from us is form making in another register, form making in another gear, forms with, again, the power and currency of software that are able to alter the disposition of an organization. And we need to be better tuned to read that disposition. This is going to seem so corny to talk about this, but Mark Twain, when he was a steamboat captain, wrote that he felt when he was reading The Water that he was reading a completely different kind of very dangerous, a novel with all kinds of dangerous tales. And what he was reading were little ripples and dimples on the water that told you a little bit about what was going on underneath, while the passengers who couldn't read that novel were seeing like pretty landscape pictures. So architects need to get better at reading that that disposition, what are the markers, the little bits of code, the active forms that create that disposition in organizations, and also become accustomed to it not being a thing. Disposition is the sort of character or propensity in an organization that results from all of its organizational activity. It's the medium, not the message. It's not the pattern printed on the fabric. It's the way the fabric floats. It's not what the game piece looks like. It's the way the game piece plays. It's not the text, but the updating software that manages the text. Not the object form, but the active form. And it's not knowing that. It's knowing how. So how does one look for markers or active forms or little bits of code in the operating system? I mean, we usually just don't treat spaces like that as we think of them as collections of objects and volumes, and agencies only assigned to the moving parts or the inhabitants. We're less accustomed to the idea that space, rather than code or text, can be a carrier of information. So it's important to think, like Gregory Bateson said, a man, a tree, and an axe is an information system, and that information resides in relative position and relationship. And maybe we sort of really do know. I mean, we know in this field of identical suburban houses that the matrix space is doing something. If the singularly crafted building, architects rush to make a single volume in that space, right? But the activity that's really going on is a kind of agricultural set of sequenced moves that make a crop of 17,000 homes. And to engage that, to hack into it, one has to not redesign a single house as an object form, but it's more powerful to think about, for instance, designing a multiplier or a contagion that uses the organization as a carrier. Just like the elevator changed urban morphology. And one could go on and on. You could design a valve, design a governor, design a switch that directs a flow of multiple objects. Very different from what we typically do. An updating platform for designing a stream of spaces. We can tune a network topology or the wiring of an organization. Like the Königsberg Bridge problem was first an urban problem. We know something about the political temperament of these dispositions, of these topologies, how they concentrate power or opposition. But here's a simple example of a software that's not making a thing, but making a set of relationships and protocols. It's my favorite example. It's a new world city called Savannah, Georgia. It's 18th century American city, and the designer Oglethorpe didn't design the plat. He didn't sort of design the whole plan and have people divide it up. He was trying to avoid speculation, so he developed a growth protocol, a set of interdependencies between the space. The town would grow by wards, each of which provided a quotient of public and private space. And then each also, once you had one ward, you had a remote reserve of space outside the city. So the town would grow. You couldn't know what the shape of the town was. You only had a time-released instruction for its ongoing activities of the urban space. So in the spatial softwares that are currently circulating around the world, there's one dominant software that I've been writing about called the Free Zone. It's the most popular urban software now. It's the infrastructural technology that the world now uses to make cities. And the promotional videos are all the same. There's a zoom from outer space. It locates a point in the world. It demonstrates that point is at the center of the world. There's a kind of deep movie trailer voice that lists requisite features. There's a stirring kind of dynasty music that swoops through cartoon skylines and resorts and suburbs and sun flares. It's a relatively dumb enclave formula that produces suboptimal economic results, and we don't really know why we're using it, except that we're using it, and it's created a kind of global addiction to incentivized urbanism. As a software, it's kind of an MS-DOS. But the wild mutations of the form over the last 30 years make it look sort of insanely penetrable. It has ancient roots in pirate enclaves and free ports, but in the 20th century, it mutated from a warehouse compound for storing free trade goods, custom free trade, to a UNIDO-sponsored instrument for jump-starting the economies of countries wanting to enter into the global marketplace. And it instructed them to create an independent authority, independent of their host country, that would grant all kinds of incentives, like cheap labor, no unions, no strikes, deregulation of labor and environmental law, tax holidays, and it goes on and on. So while it remained backstage and was actually considered to be a suboptimal economic instrument, once it was taken over, the idea taken over by China and also used in the Middle East, it began sort of to become a self-fulfilling prophecy and a form that wasn't reabsorbed by the domestic economy, but instead absorbed the whole of the domestic economy, basically swallowed the city. And now the zone takes center stage as the germ of a city-building epidemic that's modeled on Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong. So the zone that used to look like this, or this, it's a maquiladora in Tijuana, or this, now looks like this, or this, or this. In the 60s, there were a handful. Now there are thousands, some measured in hectares, some measured in square kilometers. The zone is the nexus of every one-stop, clean slate, neoliberal entry into a foreign country. Every country now wants that mirror-tiled skyscraper. It's still the space of sweatshops and dormitories, still the site of hidden labor abuse. And it has, speaking of disposition, a kind of isomorphic disposition, fosters a kind of special stupidity that permits no contradiction. It's an information-rich environment that draws down a lot of information so that it can remain information poor. It's naturalized a form of lawlessness. And now, sort of surpassing irony, major cities and even national capitals want to have their own zone doppelganger, their own zone proxy or pirate. This is New Songdo City, which is a double of Seoul in the Incheon Free Trade Zone. The developer of this, Stanley Gale, calls it a city in a box. It's based on New York, Venice, and Sydney. It has a Central Park. It has a World Trade Tower. It has a canal street. But even more strange is Astana, the newly minted capital of Kazakhstan, as free trade zone. So it's a capital that's made itself into a lawless zone. This is where President Nazarbayev is sort of trying to launch a new kind of paleo-Genghis competition with Dubai. So the zone, but given the zone's ambition to be a city, it maybe already carries the genetics of its own reversal or anecdote. So the way that one can hack into this is to use its own ecstatic enthusiasm for itself to perhaps map zone incentives onto the existing city rather than ex-urban enclaves, almost as if swapping out the wiring, changing from serial to parallel computing, and transplanting some selected incentives to Nairobi or Guadalajara or Moscow or Quito instead of an ex-urban enclave, returning the zone to the rule of law, and finally, more directly, returning financial benefits to the domestic economy. It's a really simple, it's kind of dumb, elementary idea, but it's not so dumb when a designer can begin to position that as a contagion within a larger population of zones. It's the difference between making a master plan and a contagion. It's the difference between knowing that and knowing how. I hope I would have time just to show you one other example of what would be a software, what would be a hack into a software. We can look at another huge shift in global infrastructure space by dropping down into East Africa, specifically Kenya. the last place on Earth, as you know, to receive international fiber optic cable, but one of the places now poised to experience explosive telecommunications growth. So this is, what it looked like in 2009. This is now, it's flush with broadband. And while the world had, as you all know this, but while the world in 2000 had 750 million cell phones, now it has over 6.8 billion, and 3/4 of those are in the developing world. World Bank calls the mobile telephony the world's largest shared platform, more important than water. And any urbanist worth their salt would know all kinds of things about how an infrastructure territorializes, an infrastructure like a highway or a railroad. But we're really under-rehearsed in knowing how microwaves operate, how they territorialize. It's a mixture of choke points between a very linear fiber optic cable that territorializes like a railroad almost, in a very physical way, and then a kind of atomized population of handsets and the choke points and ISPs between them. In Kenya, there's lots of those 28-year-old McKinsey consultants and economists and bankers on the ground, and they're developing, the development expertise is spoken in languages of business and technology, informatics, econometrics, all trying to predict, development 2.0. And there's also plenty of new entrepreneurs who are writing softwares for billions of cell phones. You've heard of all of this, M-Pesa and so on. But no one's really leading with spatial variables, and the spatial consequences are treated as kind of accidental byproducts of these softwares. The only really formula that's out there for space is the outmoded zone again. Even as broadband is giving these cities capacity to completely dissolve the zone. But you see the same kinds of things for Kanza Technocity, again coming from the stratosphere, and this is what it looks like. Or a LAPSET. It's a project which is treated as a good idea. It's a transportation corridor between Lamu and Juba, and it would allow Juba, a new country, South Sudan, to get its oil to the coast without having to go through Khartoum and the north. But it also is a pretty sad thing when Kenya's poised to finally harness a technology that in some ways allows it to invert expectations about the need for roads as a sign of progress. And here it is kind of in adopting an old and potentially dangerous development formula around heavy resource extraction. So it's an obvious candidate Nairobi is an obvious candidate for the zone that's mapped back onto the city, for the anti-zone. And when it does that, several different things are added to several different interdependencies are added to the software. Another is that suddenly there's more available labor on site, and that interdependence also then leverages another possibility for transit, which Nairobi sorely needs. But one could also look at village protocols in Kenya, where dialing up broadband to attract universities and tourism has to be working in an interdependency with dialing down roads to preserve wilderness that tourism and university research rely on. The roads are essential for access, and they're always seen as a kind of source of progress, but they also inflate spaces, which make it, if access to information, and that information being the information that's digitally online, as well as the information that's in the city, the information that I am saying is being carried in space, access to that information has to be modulated by dealing with the physical sizes of things, reducing road capacity that allows, that doesn't inflate the travel distances that one needs to actually take advantage of a university or to preserve a wilderness. So populous countries like Africa that are already giving the world new business models and new apps like M-Pesa and Ushahidi might give the world a real lesson in a new contagious spatial software. I won't go into this because I don't think there's time, but I'll just say yet another spatial software that I've been working on is a protocol for not putting the development machine into forward, but how to put it into reverse. This is something that architects don't really work on because we think we've only got object form. But this is a software which is looking about not how to accumulate more object forms in urbanism, but how to subtract development, how to relieve buildings of their existence. In the Amazon rainforest, again, where roads are destructive, or a floodplain in New Orleans or Bangkok, or McMansion's suburbia. These places where it's considered entirely rational to leave it to economists or running the financial market or others working on the carbon market to create often very dangerous relationships between sites. This is sort of saying, what if you made spatial protocols that linked properties in a way that can concentrate, shrink, or subtract development in ways where the risks and rewards are also much more visible. So developing a protocol like a governor, sort of like Savannah in reverse, that ratchets and links properties, gives them micro shares in each other and in the industries that take over where they took off. And it might be appropriate in many parts of the world. So I'll just finish by saying that the things that make this infrastructure space powerful, it's irrationality, it's softwares, it's fictions, it's undeclared but consequential activities, or perhaps also the very things that make it immune to righteous declaration and prescription. So the rational, the resolute, the righteous, these are important cornerstones of dissent, but I'm working on a kind of auxiliary support form of activism that's relying on the discrepant and the fictional and the sly. And infrastructure space gives some very special tools for that. It tutors a sort of shrewder, cagier counter to the lubricated agility that most global powers with which most global powers can operate. So it's looking for an alternative extra statecraft. Thank you.